And I think we're good. And there we are. All right, this has been another exciting day here at the museum. Lots of fun stuff going on. We are looking at trying to get some different things figured out, and as we've done that, we're moving closer towards what we need to do. So, right now, I am going to start talking about the topic for today. I was wanting to look at the history of the Marshals Service and how it looked at defending national security in different ways. There's a number of reasons why I want to talk about this subject. One of those being that is spurred by a recent gift we received from a person who was in the District of Wyoming for many years. He ended up retiring as a deputy. His name is Oscar Stearman. He was a deputy U.S. Marshal. He ended up passing away, and his family went through his belongings, found some things that they'd like us to have. So I'm going to do a little bit of show and tell with that here in a little bit. Along the same lines, there are some different subjects that are related to the topic of national security. And some of those different subjects are easier than others. Some of them, it's kind of hard to relate to them, maybe given where we are in our American history and looking back the way that we do. But I listed out those three topics earlier in the social media messages that we sent out. One of those being how the Marshals played a role in dealing with enemy aliens in the United States during specifically War of 1812, Confederate sympathizers during the American Civil War, and with German nationals here in America in World War I. After that, the role was taken over by the FBI and military and others. I know there's some other rougher conversations we could have a little bit later regarding the treatment of people who are foreign nationals, much less people who are American citizens during World War II. The other things I was wanting to talk about were related to the draft dodgers. During the forced military draft registration that occurred over the history of our country at different points, but specifically coming into World War I, going into World War II, and then going into Vietnam. The Marshals were involved in those actions to a certain point. And then finally, I was wanting to talk about the role of the Marshals in defending our nuclear arsenal in the way of talking about the elements of our arsenal that were nuclear missiles being transported around the country. And so we definitely, Marshals have a role to play in a lot of those different aspects of this. So three very different ways to look at the Marshals' role in the defense of the country. Specifically regarding the, I want to start out with the War of 1812, that time frame. Remember at this point, it was up until just immediately prior to the Civil War that the Marshals Service was under the auspices of the Department of State, not the Department of Justice, or more appropriately at that point, the Attorney General's office. The Department of State was responsible, and under previous laws that had been passed, specifically the Alien and Sedition Act and some other things along those lines, the Marshal Service, well, at the time the Office of Marshal, had been directed to go through and register different individuals to look at them in the way of who they were and whether or not they were people who would go through and who would have allegiance to their country, and if they were found to be people who were not interested or not supportive of the government. And it was like some laws that since that time We've since obviously done away with some of those laws. The Supreme Court has seen that a number of these laws are not legal. But one of the things that was done and what I'm doing right now is I'm moving a couple of things around to help get a visual on this for you. Let's go ahead and bring that back up there and bring this back here. What I am wanting to do here is I'm going to show a couple of things regarding how this is. And so this here is using our, let me go ahead and I'll kill that. This is from the War of 1812 papers National Archives has. These are U.S. Marshals returns of enemy aliens and prisoners of war during that time frame. These are all British citizens and British subjects. And so I'm going to go ahead and let's see here if I can get, while I am doing this, I'm trying to, no, never mind, let's go ahead and we'll just keep this way. All right, so these are British subjects that, in this case, this is a return of Barnabas Smith, appointed under Peter Cortenius, Marshal of New York District, to receive reports from all British subjects residing in the counties of Cayuga and Seneca from the 9th day of September to the 12th day of the same month, and it's 1812. And then so they have a listing of all the British citizens. And remember, these are not American citizens who were originally British. Most of the American subjects at this time were formerly British or descendants of British, but keep in mind this is also 40 years on from the beginning of the American Revolution. This is 20 years on from the founding of the nation in 1789. These are all people who had moved to the Americas after the American Revolution and were not considered to be citizens of our country. So to look a little bit more at some of this, what they're asking on each of these is they have a name, they have an age, they have time that they've been in the United States, typically in years, family members, they have a place of residence, they've got occupation or pursuit. Many of these here are farmers. There's a distiller of whiskey, a tailor, another distiller, laborers, and more farmers. Date of application to the courts of naturalization. And so no application for most of these, one of them in January of 1862. And then remarks. And so some of these are friendly to the present administration, a respectable subject and a good friend of the government, friendly to the American government, peaceable and well disposed. Let me see here, peaceable and inoffensive, a respectable young man and inoffensive. There are a few of these who are people who are not happy with the American government. And so their job in these cases was to identify these people, and if they were not supporting of the United States, they would then take them and move them inland farther. There was a case specifically, and I'm going to pull this out of the book that was done by Frederick Calhoun, or some other things related to that. Frederick Calhoun was was a historian of the United States Marshals Service. And so there's a number of cases where he's talking about the administration turned to the marshals. Congress had made provision for their use in the Militia Act of 1795. Okay, and that's actually referring to another point I was willing to make as part of this. But that goes back to the need to have soldiers to enforce these. So they could go through and enforce that, but then the marshals then went through to register everyone. There were cases in which 7 military officers of the British Navy were in America, and the local marshal was instructed to tell them that either they had to leave the service in the military or they had to move, I think it was 40 miles inland. There were many different ways that the marshals went through to report this, and so they kept track of them. Pennsylvania had 3,364 enemy aliens. New York had 3,100. Total of almost 12,000 British aliens during that war, and so they wanted to keep track of them for that purpose. This mission continued on again, like I said, through the American Civil War and then into World War I. During World War I, there were 480,000 German enemy aliens registered. During that time frame, 6,300 enemy aliens were arrested under presidential warrants. The Germans, if you were a German citizen, this is not American citizens of German descent, they had to surrender all weapons, explosives, and radios. I'm assuming they mean two-way radios, but it's possible that they meant radios of any kind. Specific enemy aliens had to be turned over to the War Department for internment. And this is those enemy aliens, those Germans who were very supporting of the German cause in World War I. Arrests, and they had actually small camps for specific people, but by no means did they arrest all German citizens or all people who are German Americans. They only arrested small numbers. So the way that ended up happening, it was very specific, and it was very limited on how they were going to do that, with the exception of removing all enemy aliens from Washington, D.C. They did end up having to do that. My favorite element of all of this, though, is the second subject I was going to talk about, dealing with draft dodgers. Dealing with not just during, as I kind of hinted at, during the American Revolution, the Militia Act required draftees to be reported, and those draftees ended up having to report themselves, report to the local militia meetings. If you did not report for that, you would get into trouble, and the marshals could go and arrest you and force you to then show up. There we go. All right. So you have, as part of that, you continue to go on as anytime that there's a forced conscription into the military, and this goes all the way back to the founding of our country, where all able-bodied men were expected to be part of the militia, and they were all expected to be armed for militia purposes. If they didn't own a weapon, the local militia the unit would be able to provide weapons, and typically these were not great weapons. These were not hunting rifles. There's a lot that's been made of the Minutemen and the way that people were armed during the American Revolution. It wasn't quite as cut and dry as some people think it was, but it continues on, though, until up through the Vietnam War and then into the end of military conscription after Vietnam. But during World War I specifically, what was interesting me is both on one hand how much the marshals were having to go out and find these people, and how much society was in their forced patriotism. That was the origination of the term slacker. If you look historically, the term slacker was rarely used prior to 1916, 1917. And then all of a sudden there's this huge boom in the use of the word slacker. And it specifically referred to those men who were trying to do what they could to avoid the draft. And so as part of that, you start seeing some different issues, some different campaigns against slackers. There was a film, The Slacker, that was made during 1917 about these people. During World War I, there were more than 222,000 violations of selective service laws. In other words, slackers. 250,000, almost a quarter of a million men who refused to show up for military duty or refused to register for the selective service at that time. Later in 1917, the Marshals were given the job to protect selective service centers, arrest draft evaders or those disrupting selective service. In other words, those people who are telling other people don't sign up for your selective service. Other things that they were setting up to do is they were also in 1917, they were there to arrest military deserters and assist the fledgling Bureau of Investigation in finding them. This leads to two different really violent cases I was surprised to come across in the history of the Marshals Service. One of them is actually mentioned in our Hall of Honor. There was a Deputy U.S. Marshal in Arizona, Frank Haynes. He was tasked with going to find these two men, John and Thomas Powers, who were evading the draft. He goes out, he finds this is out in the boonies in Arizona, goes to Graham County, finds the Sheriff McBride, enlists him and two of his deputy marshals, his deputy sheriffs in his county to go and find these two young men. They're both in their 20s, to go bring them back so they can go register for the draft and go into the Army. And this is in February of 1918. They're so far back in the hills. If you know anything about Arizona, northeast of Tucson is nothing but mountains and desert and scrub, silver mines, almost nothing else. This is a little bit a ways from Fort Grant, a little bit southwest of there, a few miles. And they go up, they ride in, they had to get hold of horses and ride overnight, about a 12-hour, 10 or 12-hour ride to get to the house where these people are holed up. They surround the house. The people inside don't want to go. By the time everything is said and done, the father of the two boys is killed. The two deputy sheriffs and the sheriff for the county are killed. The deputy marshal is able to get away. The two boys get away with a friend of theirs. And when there's three people who just died in the line of duty. One of them is currently mentioned on our wall, and we're going to start looking into this situation a little bit more with the historian from the Marshals Service, because I really honestly think the county sheriff and the other deputy sheriff should also be on the wall as well. So we're going to find out what we can do to take care of that. I know some work was done previously on those, but we're not quite sure why all three of them aren't listed when they really should be. There's another case up in Wisconsin that in some ways I think is very reminiscent of some of today's modern sovereign citizen movement. There was a family out in the Kruger family up in Wisconsin, between two little small towns, Owen and Withee. They had a farm, and they were refused on religious grounds to sign up for the draft. And so they refused to sign up for the draft, and the two deputies come out to say, hey, you guys need to sign up for the draft, and if possible, they might need to arrest them. They show up as soon as they get onto the property and declare who they are. They start receiving gunfire. So they immediately go to the little town that's just up the road. They enlist a number of volunteers as a posse to come back and then try to take these men. A gunfight starts up. As soon as they come onto the property, again, there's a high-power rifle shot, kills one of the members of the posse instantly. By the time everything is said and done, the house is riddled with holes, the barn is burnt down. They find one of the men that they were sent there to arrest was injured. They end up going on a manhunt for the others. Several people on the posse were injured. They find an arsenal of about half a dozen or a dozen guns and a few thousand rounds of ammunition. They had just apparently, within a couple of days prior to this, purchased two high-power rifles, which I would assume are some level of .30 caliber rifle, and then 350 rounds of ammunition, in addition to everything else they had. And so they ended up facing off against that posse. And so I'm going to start working with the historian of the Marshals Service to find out why this particular individual was never listed as a line of duty death also, just being a posse member. So, I mean, this opportunities like this come up, and you find both research opportunities, but it's also, these are really violent cases that you wouldn't expect in the way of draft dodgers doing this, much less slackers by our own common definition of the word, using it today. But really, it's just some interesting stories coming up with that. But then again, the draft dodging, it's not really a surprise. It's something that still up through Vietnam was, as we all know, was a big issue. And up through Vietnam, that particular case was, there's a number of cases where it was a little bit different. A lot of that was turned over to the FBI more than it was turned over to the, more than what it was turned over to anything to do with the marshals. So as we continue to look through here, I'm going to start putting my gloves on because I'm going to show you some stuff related to this individual right here. And that right there is Oscar Stearman, and that's in 1990, and that's him as a Deputy U.S. Marshal in his escort uniform next to his United States Marshals Ford Bronco. And this is, as soon as I can find my other glove, I'm going to show you. This is the cap that he's wearing in that photo. And you can see even the little pin. That's a mounted police, Royal Canadian Mounted Police pin that he has on his Marshals Service ball cap. And let's see, which picture was that? That was him in the blue on blue. This is that uniform shirt that he is wearing there, complete with United States Marshal Missile Escort patch. And so it's just like a law enforcement shirt. United States Marshal silver patch on the front. And then the other shirt that we don't have just one uniform, we have a second uniform that he also wore. This one has a pair of similar blue ripstop pants with cargo pockets. And then again, silver United States Marshals patch. And then United States Marshal U.S. Air Force Space Command Missile Escort. And then on the back of this one, though, Police U.S. Marshal. And these are both uniform shirts that he would have worn. There's not a whole lot of actual uniforms as per se that the Marshal Service has ever had identified. So the missile escort, and this is one of the things Sharon just asked, that's what I was going to bring up, is starting in 1975, the United States Air Force requested that the Marshal Service come to start assisting them in the escorting of any of their missiles that were getting transported across the United States. And so anytime that there was a nuclear missile being transported, the Marshals would be there to be on the site, partially because they could go across state lines. They had ultimate jurisdiction, and they still to this day have the largest jurisdiction of any law enforcement agency that you can come across. And so if anything came up, they were able to sit there and have all the authority that they needed to be able to do whatever the job required. And so they would be seen if you lived in Wyoming, Montana, the Dakotas, parts of Kansas, parts of Nebraska, heck, even here in Arkansas, there were nuclear missile emplacements. And they didn't just build those missiles in sight. They built those missiles somewhere else, threw them on trailers, carted them across the country, and then once they arrived at wherever they were, then they would be done. But what I didn't realize until a couple of years after I started here at the Marshals Museum is my first encounter with a Deputy United States Marshal was very likely on I was driving up through the center part of Montana. There's a little geographical feature called Judith Gap, and there's a little tiny convenience store gas station that's sitting right there. And we went in, and there were a bunch of Air Force kids walking around. They had their rifles slung, and they had their Humvees out in front because they were there as part of a security detail because there was maintenance going on at a missile silo that's just like 2 miles north of that particular gas station. But one of the people who was there was a Deputy U.S. Marshal standing there getting coffee with all the rest of them. And he was, by this point, the uniforms, I believe that they'd stopped using the uniforms, or because they weren't transporting, they were just doing something active with the weapons. He wasn't wearing a uniform for it, but he had the star down on his belt, and he had a sidearm, and I mean, he was a deputy marshal. And that was the first time that I remember actually seeing a deputy marshal in the wild. So just because I never was around anything like that prior. But that was a neat part of our country's history as far as the Marshals Service is concerned. It was a job that was done. The guys who, and again, mostly, I keep referring to guys, it was mostly guys who did this job, and they were very proud of what they did. Thousands of weapons were transported across the country at different points with these details present. And so it was a neat thing. Is rightfully, I think it's something that they should be very proud of. But it was really neat though, because a few weeks ago I got a phone call from a deputy up in Wyoming, said, hey, this has just happened. The family came to us. They have this material. We thought it was something that was different. Would you guys be interested? And we're sure. If there's ever anything like this that you know of that is related to the Marshals Service and the history of the Marshals Service, we're always happy to talk to you and find out what it is. And if it's something that helps us tell the story, we're more than happy to, very likely we will accept it. Now I do have what to tell you right now. I think we're pretty full up on things like raid jackets. We've got quite a few ball caps. There's a few things like that, so please don't get offended if we say no, this isn't really something we want. But this is one of those things that really helps us to be able to tell this story. And so not just here online, but in the future, once we get our fundraising complete and we're able to start building up the story here inside the building, we will be able to use that to help better tell the story. And that's really what we're here for, is to tell the story of the Marshals, 230 plus years. And as we go, one more thing I forgot to show earlier. And again, back to doing a little bit of a show and tell. There is, as part of the early history of the Marshal Service, when I was talking about the War of 1812 and the returns, and I showed an example of one of the returns from New York. This here is our oldest. I'm going to take again, like I did, was it last week or the week before? Gloves off. This is the oldest document that we have in our collection. And this is a letter that is an appointment of, well, let's see, I've got to get my mind back on it here. This is the appointment from James Prince, who's Marshal for the District of Massachusetts. He's appointing Thompson J. Skinner to be his deputy. James Prince was the Marshal for Massachusetts. This is 1907. He kept getting appointed as the Marshal. He would get reappointed several times. So during the War of 1812, he was the U.S. Marshal for the District of Massachusetts. He was the Marshal who was sending out deputies, or even possibly himself, going out and registering these enemy aliens who were the British citizens who were living in the Americas. So this is one of those same people who would have gone out and done this. This right here is the second oldest object we currently have in our collection. I don't usually bring it out, but this was definitely one of those things One of the fun stories with this is James Prince, the marshal who wrote this letter, appointed this particular deputy Skinner. Skinner was the previous U.S. Marshal for the district, and it's one of those things at the time, the marshals, quite often when they left office, there was no instructions for the next marshal. So in this case, Skinner and Prince were both friends. Prince comes on as the marshal, he brings Skinner on as a deputy, and Skinner, I'm assuming, could show him the ropes for a while, say, hey, this is what's going on, and then after a couple of years, Skinner could go off and do his own thing. But I'm sure there's a great story in this. I would love at some point when I get the time to go through those returns and see if Prince or Skinner show up in any of the returns from the District of Massachusetts, listing out any of those individuals. So, but all in all, like, it's just really neat, fun ways to look at our American history and the role that the marshals have played, not just safeguarding the judiciary, I talked about that a couple weeks ago, but safeguarding just our country in general, making sure the process works, making sure that people recognize that we have legal responsibilities stated out that we need to follow. With that, I think I've been forgetting to do this. I want to remind you, we do have you can buy the brick campaign. We're about ready to start getting some of our first round of bricks put into the ground, and I'm sure we're going to be sharing lots of pictures of that when it happens. We also are looking at, we have a GoFundMe. You can go to our webpage and get to either one of those two and be able to help spread the word. Also, we are going to continue doing these on Fridays. There's a possibility that one of these next couple of Fridays we're going to have to give it a miss because we have something else going on here in the building, but we'll find out. We have lots of things going on. If you have any questions, if you have anything in the way of a suggestion, if you have topics you want to see us play out, if you want to see any particular subjects, if you want to if there's some U.S. Marshals Service story that you want to see highlighted, if you want to see if there's some particular historic site or location that you know has something to do with Marshals Service history, but you want to get a little bit more information about it, holler at us. We might see if we might be able to interview somebody from one of those sites. I know there's 2 or 3 sites right now that I'm about ready to send out invitations to see if they'd be interested in coming on the show and talking. And so we're going to go ahead and continue to work towards the future and continue to try to tell these stories and help see what we can do to help everybody learn more about the Marshals. So if you, otherwise, please stay safe, please stay well, wear a mask, stay away from others, and have a good weekend. Bye-bye.